Welcome to the Alain interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
So today we interview Jeremy Scheck, who became very well known very young, just after he ended his university at Cornell University. And he is especially well known because he wrote a book that has been very popular, ScheckEats Cooking Smarter. What is your book about?
Yeah,
Jeremy?
so my cookbook is about easy, accessible recipes. And the main thing that makes it different is that the recipes are based on a set of staple ingredients. So the recipes either only use those ingredients, or if it's like a chicken dish where you wouldn't expect to have chicken in the refrigerator at all times, all of the other ingredients are on the list of staple ingredients. And so if I ask in the list for a certain condiment, then I give you several recipes to use it in. Or there's only 10 spices that are used across the book also, to make it accessible for people who don't want to be shopping at a million different places, or every time you open a recipe and there's just like 30 different ingredients. There's also like no mixers required for all of the baking recipes. So it's just inspiring people to get in the kitchen and create wholesome food without as much of a barrier to entry as other books might have.
You went to Cornell University, right? But you didn't study only food science. You studied Italian, Spanish, and other things. Why did you decide to be involved in food science? Was that something you had in mind since you were a child? Do you have some examples around you in your family? How did it start? Because normally people don't go to university to become a cook, right? So how did it come to your mind?
So I had never heard of food science as a child until one of my sleepaway camp counselors told me that he was going to study food science at Ohio State University. And I just never heard those words together in the first place. And I must have been 15 or 16 at the time, and it really interested me. And so around that time, I also got a job at a local bakery in Washington, D.C. And I was thinking about colleges and university, and I was thinking about what I might want to study, and it just kept coming back as something that I was interested in. And at the time, I was also in an international baccalaureate high school, which gave us a lot more freedom when it came to the types of projects we did in school. And so whenever I had a chemistry or biology or even math class that I needed to do a project for, I would always find a way to make it about food, whether it was like different ways that you prepare a cake and how that affects the density. And then I would write a statistics paper on it, or how the different proteins might affect the texture of a cookie. And so
were you cooking yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Every single day I would make something and bring it in for my friends the next day at school, to the point that some friends would even start to sort of get hungry in expectation of my treats that I would bring in. And if on the rare occasion I didn't bring something in that day, they would like be actually hungry because they were so used to me bringing something in every day.
Was your mother a cook? Or was there a special cooking in your family? You lived in Washington, but what kind of examples you had around you?
My mom is a very competent cook. I'm one of 4 brothers, and she always cooked for us out of wanting to have wholesome, nutritious food. And it's not a passion of hers by any means. And I started off baking more because my mom sort of had dinner handled. And she also was very health conscious. And so by me making my own sweets was a way for me to have sweets at home, since we didn't have a lot of processed foods available at home. So it was sort of my shortcut. My paternal grandmother is also an excellent cook, and I might have gotten the recipe testing and writing genes from her, because I still have a very large archive of hundreds of her recipes, and I love to cook with her. And she would do very elaborate holiday meals, and she's still alive, but she's a lot older now. And so it's nice to be able to take over her special recipes and recreate that, because my uncles and cousins and siblings definitely expect the same things that she used to make 20 years ago and even before I was born. But I never knew that exactly I wanted to take it so seriously. But my attitude was, when I got the job at a bakery and I also started writing my food blog at the same time, I sort of thought, I love food. What if I took it seriously for a little bit and see where it takes me? And that also led me to apply to Cornell Early Decision for food science, which I ended up taking probably a third of my classes relating to food science.
You were curious or influenced by the movement of the slow food, or Carlo Petrini or Alice Waters, this kind of...
Yeah, I think that came up for me once I got more interested in Italian cuisine and the Italian language, because I ended up lining up an internship with Italy in New York City my sophomore year of college, which ended up being canceled because of COVID. And that's when I started making my videos. But that's what I thought, I'm going to work in marketing for Italy, and they're very involved with the slow food movement. And so that came up a little bit later. But I think I was still in high school when the series and book Salt, Fast, Acid, Heat came out by Samin Nosrat, who's an Iranian American chef. And I think she worked with Alice Waters. And she was also someone that showed a lot of the science behind cooking and was an early inspiration for me.
So what did you learn in Cornell? I mean, how was it? You said a third of your time was in food science, but then you were also interested obviously in literature, right? You studied Italian literature. Why Italian and Spanish?
I went to a Spanish elementary school. My elementary school right outside Washington, D.C. in Maryland was all in Spanish, all of the academics. So from an early age, I had that window into language. And when I arrived at Cornell as a food science major, thinking that was going to be the vast majority of my classes, I had just come back from being an au pair in Spain over the summer, living with a family. And unfortunately, the full food science program felt a little too restrictive for my interdisciplinary interests. I wanted to take the food classes, but I also wanted to take Spanish classes. So pretty early on, I realized that I would want to switch to something that gave me more flexibility, which is what I did. So I switched from the agriculture college to the arts and sciences liberal arts college. Since I did already speak Spanish fluently, I tested out of all of the classes that were not major requirements, and then I decided to start Italian from scratch. And so I took 3.5 years of Italian classes and ended up with a double major in it. I took really interesting classes like Italian food culture. I also took this class, which was considered an animal science class. It was dairy study in Italy. So we went to Italy in January of 2020 and visited a dozen dairy farms and cheese factories. I was the only student that spoke Italian in the class. I was still learning, but I was pretty conversational.
Professor von Wittelsbach was your professor?
She was my first professor. So I did an intensive elementary Italian class with her, which basically accelerated the first 2 semesters. And I was so enthralled by Italian, and I didn't really have the experience before of learning a language, in quotes, because when I learned Spanish, I was 5 years old. I didn't know that people went to school in their native language. It was just like, that's what I went to school and the teacher spoke in Spanish. And a month later, we all understood everything that was going on. But also when I started learning Italian, it felt less like I was learning a new language from scratch that I really needed to study. And it felt more like I was unlocking synonyms to a language that I already understood. So I found that I could just hear something, for the most part, said correctly in Italian one time, and I would just sort of internalize it and already get it. And I didn't really have to proactively read vocabulary lists.
Italian cuisine is maybe more famous than Spanish cuisine, right? I mean, all over the world.
Certainly.
So you were probably also attracted by that. And
For sure.
And are your recipes that you promote, that you show in you? Are they more about Italian cuisine, Spanish cuisine, American cuisine, your own cuisine? I mean, what's the
mix? I love a mix. I particularly like Italian cuisines. I personally enjoy Italian cuisine a little bit more than Spanish cuisine. I do love all of the different Latin American cuisines a lot. But since I do have an interest in the language, I love being able to read recipes in the original language and not view it through a filter of someone else's translation. And so that's like whether I was making orecchiette and bari with different nonne on the street or learning about guancia brazzata in Turin, I just really enjoyed in Italy the openness of the people. And then there's not so many foreigners that learn Italian. So I think they also have a special appreciation for people who do take the effort to do that.
What do you find special? Because there are many other cuisines, obviously. There is Asian cuisine, French cuisine, Mexican cuisine, Moroccan cuisine, and so on and so forth. Lebanese cuisine and Indian. And why did you concentrate in these two cuisines? Because of the language? Because you studied it?
I think that one thing that really interests me, because there are so many Italian Americans, is the differences between how that cuisine changed through immigration in the US and sort of the Italian American cuisine that I grew up on versus what evolved separately in Europe and continued to evolve after people immigrated. And I think that is really interesting, both thinking about the cuisine, but also the language, because if you go to like New Jersey or New York, you'll hear Italian Americans saying words in other Italian dialects that sort of predate the standardization of Italian. And then also a lot of the cuisine people say is sort of time capsule of things that were popular at the time of their immigration. And also,
so what is the difference?
There's so many differences, but there's a lot of dishes that I think Americans grow up as thinking as quintessentially Italian that would just never fly in Italy, like chicken parmigiana, melanzane alla parmigiana. I was just in Sicily and I had swordfish alla parmigiana, which I had never tried before. But chicken parmesan, as they say in the US, is a lot more common. And just putting chicken on pasta in general, it fascinated me to learn about all of the implicit food rules in Italy, whether it's we don't eat this with this, we do put cheese on this dish, but never put cheese on a seafood pasta, or which pastas go with which type of sauce. I just find it like a really interesting thing to learn about because as much as you think you could know, it feels like it always goes deeper.
In your book, in your blog, and everywhere, you teach how to cook special dishes at home, right? In a simple way. So you gave them the essential ingredients and so on and so forth. Obviously, these ingredients change. They're not the same in America or in Italy. So how would you describe your cuisine? International, something you can cook everywhere in the world? And the question is, who are the people who follow you? Are they Americans? Are they all over the world? Therefore, can they find all the ingredients that you suggest?
I would describe it as international comfort food, and the comfort doesn't necessarily mean in the sense of it has to be something that is super heavy or creamy all the time. I love a gratin or something very indulgent, but for me, like my mom's kale salad is also comfort food. You'll find in the book as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean one cuisine or one style, but I try to approach it with what will lower the barrier to entry to create a home-cooked meal from scratch. And the ingredients do certainly change depending on where you are. The vast majority of my audience, or like 65% is American, but I have followers all over the world. And that definitely affects like what ingredients are easily accessible. And it is a little bit different if you're not in the US. For example, as I mentioned, all of the condiments that are used on the list of staple ingredients are used in several recipes. So you never buy a bottle of maple syrup and don't have anything else to use it with. So there's muffins that use maple syrup as the primary sweetener, but there's also salad dressing that use just a touch. And since it's such a intrinsically North American ingredient, it is harder to find in other parts of the world. But that's not to say they don't sell maple syrup at Aldi. In Madrid, I had the discussion with a Spanish friend who bought my book because of the same thing. Or another ingredient that I love is Italian Calabrian chili bamba paste. It's like a fermented Italian chili paste. And they sell it at Trader Joe's in the US. So it's very accessible to most Americans. And in Madrid, I found it at a specific Italian market. So you have to go a little bit.
You like markets, right?
I love markets.
You suggest to go to markets, right?
I do. I think the most difficult ingredient for people to find sometimes that I cook with frequently is pomegranate molasses, which is known more so in the Middle East, especially in like Iranian cuisine. But even that I was able to find in Madrid, and they have it at a more upscale grocery store in the United States, like Whole Foods or something. So it's not impossible to find, but there's just so many things that you can do with it, whether it's in a dressing or a marinade or on top of fruit. I love sour and fruity flavors. So
but in a world where people try to be as healthy as possible, in a continent where there are so many obese people eating junk food and so on and so forth, how is your food? You said comfort food, but comfort food in America would be, I don't know, chicken soup, mac and cheese, things like that. Are you thinking also about people's diet, about health? And did you double check that? They say the Mediterranean cuisine is the healthiest.
So I've taken a few classes on nutrition at Cornell, but it's certainly not my area of expertise. You mentioned chicken soup. I have a recipe for chicken soup from scratch in my book. That is one of my favorite recipes in the book. It's something that I learned from my grandmother and my aunt and my mom. And anytime we were sick, she would make that. I also have a version of orzotto that is sort of a play on mac and cheese. I use orzo instead of elbow macaroni. Everything is from scratch instead of using sort of a powdered cheese. As I said before, to me, comfort food doesn't necessarily mean the creamy and the rich and the indulgent. It can also be food that makes you feel good. And so as much as I have recipes, like I have key lime pie with a ginger snap crust or vanilla birthday cake, I also have kale salad and tortilla soup, which is basically homemade chicken broth blended with a bunch of vegetables. And it was the way that my mom got my youngest brother to eat his vegetables. And it's about as healthy as you can get. So to me, comfort food has more to do with nostalgia and feeling good than a particular profile.
Yeah, but your cuisine sounds a bit elaborate. So what is it? A weekend cuisine? I mean, people sometimes don't have much time to cook, and you have lots of ingredients and things like this. Is this possible during normal day to cook like this, to come home from work and cook like this, even if you're not a cook?
Yes, certainly. So that was the tension of the book, is that I wanted the recipes to be accessible enough for a weekday, but special enough for a weekend. That's why they're based on similar ingredients so that you don't have to shop for a million different things. Yes, there's the recipe for homemade chicken broth, which you certainly would not make on a weeknight because I like to boil the chicken for at least 6 to 8 hours. But that's something that you could make on one Sunday and freeze and have to use in other recipes. And none of the ingredients that are used in them are particularly esoteric. And so I had the idea originally because when I was moving into my first apartment as a college student, I was thinking of what are the essential recipes that people should know how to make when they're becoming an adult for the first time. And I was thinking, well, you should know how to make a few dinners, so maybe a roast chicken, and then you need to know how to make a few breakfasts. And I believe that you should always have chocolate chip cookie dough in your freezer ready to bake fresh. So there were all of these ideas, and I started it geared towards college students. But the original feedback that I got was from people like friends of my mother who said, I know this is meant for college students, but I'm a busy mom and I have similar time constraints. And so I want to use these recipes anyway. And so that's why the book evolved into being accessible more broadly and not directed only for students.
Why do you live in Madrid?
I picked Madrid because I wanted to be in Europe and I wanted to practice one of my foreign languages. And so it was really between Italy and Spain. And I love to visit Italy. I was there last week, but I also didn't really see myself living in one of the major cities. I find Rome to be a little bit chaotic, and I've never felt super connected to Milan. And so I did, on the other hand, always feel connected to Madrid. It was the first international trip that I went on in my life with my grandparents when I was 12. And then I went back as an au pair when I was 18. And I just kept feeling drawn to it. And coming from New York City, where I lived before moving here, it feels very cozy, very walkable, but it also has enough going on that I don't find it boring in any way. And I just find it to be like a very charming city.
And how long do you plan to live there? Is it temporary or you moved there? And are you opening a restaurant yourself? Are you going to do that?
So I've been in Madrid for a year and a half, and the current visa that I'm on is for 3 years, but it's renewable. I see it. My move here is pretty indefinite. I would love to stay as long as I can and as long as it's working for me. I've since started leading food tours here and trips. So I've had Americans come and I do 5-day trips based in Madrid, but then we go to Ribera del Duero wine country and also Segovia for a different day trip. And we do tastings of wine and cheese and jamón ibérico and baking workshops at my friend's bakery here and get a taste of the culture and the vibe of the city. I've never felt so drawn to restaurants just because I did have the experience of working in a bakery, which was very valuable and formative, but I always felt sort of spoiled by if I am able to engage with food as my job, but I can do it from my own kitchen and from my laptop writing, I feel like it would be hard to give that up to stand on my feet for 12 hours a day in a restaurant. So in that sense, I've been a little bit spoiled, but I have had ideas about potential. I love ice cream. I would maybe love to open an ice cream shop in Madrid. Unlike Italy, which obviously has gelato as a huge part of the culture, and the US has sort of its own distinct ice cream style, Madrid doesn't really have its own style of ice cream. There's sort of Italian-inspired places mostly, and sometimes I crave an American-style ice cream, but it's something that I've more thought about, and I'm not sure. I would have to adjust my visa, and it's a little more complicated than...
Do you consider yourself a cook?
Yes, I consider myself a cook. I don't call myself a chef.
How can I be tasting? If you are a cook and you don't have a restaurant or a place, how people can taste your own food? I mean, you give suggestions, you explain, you show pictures. What about you?
If they want to taste it in real life, my food that I cooked, you got to be my friends or family, unfortunately. But that's why I share my recipes, and I have a community of over 2 million followers and people who make my recipes. I feel like that's a very intimate way. It's a lot of trust for someone to read my recipe and decide to go out and spend their money and then spend their own time making the recipe that I proposed. And so although they're not eating the food that I've made with my own 2 hands, I do feel like it's a very intimate and personal thing that they're doing if they decide to make my recipe.
But let's talk about something pasta. Do you suggest not only how to cook it or which sauce to add, also to buy Garofalo or De Cecco or another company? Do you advise about what to buy? So you do
Yes.
publicity for some specific companies or?
Sometimes. So I've partnered with different companies before, and that's one of the ways that I monetize my work because it would just be very difficult otherwise. But a lot of times the companies that I work with are more so food cookware brands. So some of my favorite brands that I've worked with are Stobe, which is a French enamel cast iron company. And I worked with them and they make these heritage pans that can last for generations and generations in the north of France. And I traveled to their factory and they're also under the Zwilling umbrella. And so I've worked with Zwilling in Germany and De Meyer, which is a Belgian company that makes top of the line stainless steel pans. And so that is something I feel a little bit more comfortable recommending. I do give my opinions on food brands. Like, if you're going to get the basic, cheapest grocery store pasta, I do like De Cecco more than Barilla. But even more so, if you're looking to spend a little bit more, there's brands like A Feltra that I really like that are extruded through bronze dyes and dried slowly in terms of pasta. But I also have recipes for making your own fresh pasta, which is something that I love to do.
What about health food, whole wheat or different kind of pastas, people who cannot eat gluten or things like that? Are you also thinking about this?
I think about it in the sense that I'm aware that a lot of people have different dietary restrictions. And in fact, in my book, around 75% of the recipes are gluten-free. And the ones that are not gluten-free are mostly ones that you could just buy your favorite brand of gluten-free pasta and use it. And that's why it's not gluten-free, because it's a pasta recipe. Or also similar for people who don't eat meat. Except for the recipes that are like, this is a chicken dish. Most of the recipes are vegetarian or easily adaptable to be vegan even. And so I'm always thinking about that because I always get questions about how can I make this. But at the same time, I am a little bit of a purist and I don't really want to swap something to be whole wheat just for the sake of it being quote unquote healthier. And it's not necessarily healthier. I think that whole wheat, if it's not processed in the sourdough method to have the nutrients broken down by the fermentation process and stuff, it's not necessarily so much healthier for you.
The
I don't
worst
really want
enemy in cuisine, I mean, that's what they say today, it's sugar, right? You talk about ice creams, maple syrup, all this is very much sugar. So what about this? Are you aware of the fact that sugar is the enemy number one?
Do you mean enemy number one in like sort of the public mindset of what we're trying to avoid?
It's not only fattening, but it's also not very good for the health.
I am of the mind that I would rather have the dish the way it's supposed to taste and have it in moderation versus having sort of a bastardized, healthified version of a dish, especially if it's an ice. I'd rather have a small portion of excellent gelato as opposed to having a massive portion of a health version of it. I'm not super interested in those sorts of substitutions that come at the cost of the flavor. I'd rather have a small slice of cake that's actually delicious instead of something that is...
You think that American people don't eat very well? All this junk food, all this thing is very bad.
I think it's very hard to make generalizations about Americans because it's such a diverse place. Certainly in places that experience food insecurity and scarcity, there are places where there's no fresh food available and people can't afford it. But also if you go to California, big cities on the East Coast, there is extremely healthy cuisine. And in my neighborhood, my parents' house, there's a farmer's market that comes to their actual street every Saturday. And we get milk and eggs delivered from a local farm. And I don't know that it's like one size fits all, because I do feel like there's, in a lot of parts in the US, like ways to be very involved in your local food system and eat local. And it depends more on what is available to you and how much interest you take in it. But now, having lived in Spain for a year and a half, I don't necessarily see that like the options at the grocery store here are so much less processed. They have just as many cookie options and candies here. So I think it has to do more with your particular family's choices.
Are you more into butter or into oil?
I'm pretty 50-50. I love a very good extra virgin olive oil, and I love a grass-fed butter. I've worked with Kerrygold butter, the Irish butter, and it's one of my favorites for baking. And in Spain, a lot of the dairy is Asturian, and I like it a lot, but I'm pretty 50-50 on butter versus oil. I feel like it both good extra virgin olive oil and good high quality butter. There's not really any sort of real substitute for either of them.
You don't suggest much the too sophisticated balsamic vinegar, right? I mean, you're not a fan of that.
I've been in Modena. I've been to Acciaierie in Modena and have had 12-year aged balsamic vinegar that I loved. We had it in one of the factories. They served it to us on fior di latte gelato, and it was one of the best things I've ever eaten. So I do really like balsamic vinegar when it's a good DOP type of it.
And what is your ideal meal for yourself? What do you like?
I think that certainly changes based on the season and what ingredients would be local and in season. So in the summer, I am usually wanting things to be a little bit lighter. So a couple weeks ago, my brother was visiting and my aunt was also in town in Madrid. So I had a little cookout on my terrace and I made a salad with a base of arugula and heirloom tomatoes from Spain. Spain has some of the best tomatoes in the world, and stracciatella and pickled shallots, marinated plums and basil, and really good extra virgin olive oil. And then I served that with chicken thighs that I marinated with saffron and apricot jam and a little bit of pomegranate molasses and za'atar. And I grilled the chicken thighs, and it was a pretty light dinner because I didn't serve it with sort of a carb that would weigh it down more. So it was just the grilled chicken with the really nice marinade and a giant salad that touched all the colors of the rainbow and had notes of acidity, which brings a lot of brightness, and creaminess from the stracciatella and pepperiness from the arugula. So that's something that I would love.
Wine?
Of course.
What kind of wine? Red, white, rosé?
So my aunt had come back from La Rioja that day, and she brought a bottle of rosé from La Rioja.
What is your favorite wine?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. When it comes to white wines, I really love a Portuguese Vinho Verde. I also love a dry Riesling. When it comes to red wines, there's little to me that beats a Nebbiolo from the Langhe region, whether it's a Barolo or Barbaresco. One of the best dinners of my life I had in Barbaresco. And I also love a Spanish Clarete or Rosé. I recently tried for the first time an Argentinian Merlot that was from a vineyard called El Enemigo. My friend, who is Argentinian, served it at a dinner party here in Madrid. I didn't know what I was tasting before I taste it, but sometimes you have wine and you're kind of like, whatever. And it was the first wine in a while that I had tried, and I was like, I need to know what this is. So it's called El Enemigo. They also make a really good Cabernet Franc. I didn't know that much about Argentinian wines, and I want to learn more because I was very impressed with it.
What did you study in Cornell? Because even if you give advice, obviously, you keep on studying, right? And what do you study? You study by meeting people, traveling, being curious, going to see places, tasting. No, this is a bit what you do.
Yes.
What did you learn in the university?
I took a wide variety of classes that had to do with Spanish, Italian, and food science. So I took classes on horticulture, where we were in fields at Cornell pruning grape leaves, viticulture and enology, learning about grape growing and winemaking, culinary science. As I mentioned, I took a dairy science class where we went to Italy and actually we're on dairy farms. And as you said, like continuing learning after college, I worked with the European Union a year or two after graduating, where it was to promote AOP cheeses from France. So I went to France and it was funded by the EU, and we went to dairy farms there and again I tried the first blue goat cheese from the cheesemaker there that invented it. So I'm always looking for ways to continue. When I travel, I like to take different food classes and I like to learn from people who live there. In addition to all the food classes that I took, I also took things like Spanish creative writing and Italian Jewish literature.
Are you interested in that? Are you keeping on reading or?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think I'm a lifelong learner and I'm always interested in learning more about food. Something that I'm very much interested in researching now, and I've started like researching whether it leads to a book or something along those lines, like sort of a longer term project, is about spice tolerance and spices in a historic sense, but also in a more personal biological sense. I think it was an Italian, once commented, it wasn't super nice, but they commented like using too many spices will ruin your palate. And I wanted to research to what extent that's really true and whether or not the level of heat and spice in that sense, or also just like using a lot of variety of spices, whether or not that can actually affect your ability to perceive foods, because spiciness in terms of heat and capsaicin is not one of the 5 tastes. It's actually a physical sensation that affects your trigeminal nerve. But I'm very interested in that. It's definitely a longer term research thing that I want to look into, because I think it's very personal and it's something that sort of affects people emotionally, because if you come from a culture like Japanese or Italian cuisine that's very focused on simplicity, you might feel strongly and maybe a little superior that you don't need so many cuisines. And I think that's beautiful in its own way.
You studied Jewish Italian literature. Did you also study Jewish Italian cuisine?
Not super in depth. I mean, I'm aware of the Jewish ghetto in Venice and Rome and how those carciofi alla Judea and sort of specific dishes that are known to be part of the Jewish Italian culture. But I would love to learn more about that because it's not something that I have really delved into deeply.
Okay, so you're only 25 years old.
Yes.
What do you have in mind for your future? What are the goals you want to achieve? Because you achieved already a lot of success in this field. What is your ambition?
I would love to be able to continue writing books. I think that's one of the most charmed jobs that you could have. I still am in disbelief that I was paid to write my first book. And so if I could continue to do that, there's not really anything better in my opinion. I also would love to grow my food tours in Spain. I think that it's a really fun way to connect with people in a personal way. Sort of what you were saying about there's not a lot of opportunities where people can try my food, but this is a way where I can really connect with people on a one-to-one level. I feel like I've won the lottery with what I get to do for my job. So as long as I can keep doing this and sort of continue, I would just be very grateful.
You've got this extraordinary number of followers on TikTok and Instagram. How did that really come about?
When COVID broke out, I was a sophomore in college at Cornell, and I was living in my first apartment off campus. COVID started, and we were told to go home and not stay on campus. So I started making videos of using up the leftover ingredients I had in my kitchen. and posting it. And at the time, I had been food vlogging for about 4 years, but mostly for my own satisfaction. My grandma was probably my most avid reader, but I was in the habit of writing down my recipes and photographing it. And as sort of a digital native, I felt how hard could it be to also upload these on TikTok. And TikTok, compared to other social media platforms, is really designed for you to find new people, because the main feed that you look at is not necessarily people that you've chosen to follow. It's people that the algorithm thinks you might be interested in seeing. So compared to other earlier platforms, which are really just you see the people that you know and chose to follow, there's a much bigger possibility of being discovered. And so pretty quickly after I started posting on TikTok regularly, I grew my followers from 0 to 50,000 to 100,000 to 1 million. And in under a year, I was at 2 million people. And I was then at home at my parents' house for 9 months. And I had some online classes, but I was pretty without other things to do and nowhere to go. So I was just posting sometimes 5 times a day of what I was eating, what I was cooking, and people just really connected with it.
Thank you very much, and my warmest wishes for continuing your success. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your interest in me.
Alain Elkann interviews.